Dass Sie so noch eingesprungen sind. Schön, dass Sie da sind.
Hello, good morning. Thank you very much, Mr. Finkele, for the kind invitation, and sorry for playing the role of being your coffee delayer. As you will see, my whole issue here will be how some people always appear to deprive us of our enjoyment. 20 years ago, roughly, happened the discovery of something that I called inter-passivity. At the time, mid-90s, I used a tool developed by Slavoj Žižek for different purposes. Žižek had pointed at the idea in psychoanalysis that the unconscious can be outside and that our innermost feelings can be agitated through outside agents. For example, his own experience that he likes it when television sitcoms laugh already in his place so that he doesn't have to watch and take care and not even has to laugh. This was a remark directed towards this paradoxical existence of feelings outside of ourselves, which was relevant for psychoanalysis. But it was helpful also very much for me as a philosopher engaged in the battles of aesthetics and spontaneous philosophies that encircle and circumvent the arts, because it allowed me to tackle something that was at the time not only unseen, but that was impossible to see within the art field. It was a necessary unseen or a necessary non-object of aesthetic theory at the time due to the fundamental assumptions of interactivity theory, which was in the mid of the 90s, an incredibly dominant theory that exerted a lot of pressure on the artists and their production. Interpassivity was impossible to see due to the fundamental assumptions that interactivity theory promoted. And these assumptions were, if the observers are active, if there is some involvement or participation of the observers, then they gain more pleasure from observing, and they also gain more freedom. They are not just passive and just watching and have to accept and swallow what the artists present to them. No, they can somehow change what they swallow, and that's better, and they are more free. Of course, if you're a little bit experienced with philosophy, you know quite well that being active is not a proof of being free. Spinoza has given some lectures on this. Not every activity is a free activity. You can be very active, but as a servant under somebody else's command, and you can be active for somebody else's profit. And now, with Žižek's remark, it became possible to see that the same also goes for pleasure. It is not true that people are more happy and that they gain more pleasure the more they are involved in something. Žižek's remarks on his own television experience proved precisely that there were some people existing who did not want to be actively involved, they didn't want to have to change what they saw, and they didn't even want to be passively involved. They didn't even want to do the enjoyment part of it. They didn't even want to laugh. So this brought us at the time to think that the relationship between people and their pleasure is much more problematic and complicated than interactivity theory assumed, and that it is also much more complicated than a more general theory of the Homo economicus would assume. I think this was also somehow the basic underlying anthropology of interactivity theory. Homo economicus theory in its basic line would be that we try as much as we can to minimize work and that we try as much as we can to maximize pleasure. But inter-passivity theory obviously proved the opposite. People did not want to maximize their pleasures. They wanted to be defended from their pleasures, and they wanted somebody else to enjoy in their place vicariously. The fact that the relationship between people and their pleasures is quite problematic became obvious only a few years later in Europe, I would claim. I think at the end of the 1990s, it became quite clear that people have a quite problematic relationship with their pleasures. We could say that at the end of the 1990s, most of what had been pleasures were seen breaking bad. So all the things that had previously been fun for adults, like drinking alcohol, smoking, having sex, or just flirting, wearing furs, high heels, driving cars, eating meat, and so on. You will certainly know other examples. All of these pleasures all of a sudden became sinister, dark, under various suspicions, political, hygienic, environmental, ethical, and so on. We could say that at the end of the 1990s, I would claim under the massive intrusion of neoliberalism and its ideological ally, postmodernity, under this impact, we observed a kind of parallactic move of culture, a parallactic move with regard to pleasure. Pleasure turned sinister. This sudden change, I think, can only be compared to changes that we sometimes observe in love life. There, the same thing can happen, and you see it sometimes better with your friends. When yesterday they told you that this person is so great and can only be loved, it's completely evident and obvious that this person can only be loved. Today they start telling you that this person is so awful, and it's completely obvious that this person can only be hated. And you see this transition going on without any mediation in between. There was not a moment of doubt. There was a moment from one obviousness to the opposed obviousness without any transition, apparently. And also this transition was not opened up by some kind of new information that people gained about their love objects. It's not that until yesterday they thought the beloved person is a shining beauty, but then after a while they discovered that unfortunately this person never arrives in time or something, and that makes it a bit embarrassing, and so they started to think over their judgment. It's not like that. If you look carefully at your friends and when you see them falling in love, ask them what is the reason why they are in love, and write down the reason for yourself, and like 3 years later, when they separate again, ask why they separate. And then you will find out that it's very often precisely the same reason. So, like 3 years ago, it was wonderful because this person was so caretaking, and finally you found somebody that really cared for you. 3 years later, it is terrible because it's totally suffocating. This person is always sitting on your face with care and no possibility. Or until yesterday, this person was witty and inspiring, and it was so wonderful because the person was intellectually so brilliant. Today it's completely unbearable because this smart ass always knows better and always has the last word and so on. And I think precisely the same went on with the breaking bad of our pleasures. We did not learn that smoking that we thought was beautiful and nice and tasted well. We did not learn all of a sudden that this was not so healthy, and then we started changing our judgments. No, This is very nicely remarked by American author Richard Klein in his beautiful book Cigarettes Are Sublime, where he said, if we had not known that cigarettes are dangerous, we would never have smoked them. It is precisely the danger to our health that makes them sublime. So what Klein remarks here, I think, can be generalized with regard to all of our pleasures. The damaging character pertains to every of our pleasures, and it is precisely that malign dimension, that evil dimension, if you want to, that makes these things sublime for us. You can even think of very apparently harmless pleasures, partying, okay, but still it messes up your flat. Or you dance as if there were no tomorrow, okay, but it costs your sleep. Even if you do such innocent things like philosophizing or going for a walk or something, you have to be ready to waste time. So you cannot say, I will philosophize now 2 minutes and then I stop and no. So there is always something that challenges us to transgress our ordinary economy of resources, time, money, sleep, soberness, whatever. This is what Georges Bataille has nicely pointed at with his notion of transgression that pertains to any of our real pleasures. And this is precisely also the reason why the typical postmodern strategy to solve this problem, the so-called non-ism, does not work. Slavoj Žižek has given a very nice list of these examples and was one of the first who analyzed this development in the 1990s. We were all of a sudden delivered with such interesting inventions like beer without alcohol, coffee without caffeine, cream without fat, sex without body contact, politics without decisions, or art without genius, and so on. So in all these practices, the malign, somehow uncanny dimension was removed. And did we become more happy? Of course not. Have you ever celebrated a party with juice? I think it does not work. And it does not work precisely because, as Richard Klein has remarked, it is the malign dimension that allows us to turn these things into the sublime. But the crucial question is here, how does this parallaxically work? How can some malign thing be turned into a sublime thing? And what is the parallaxes in culture, on the contrary, that succeeded in turning sublime things into awful things that have to be prohibited and policed away because they are so nasty and ugly and unhealthy and against appropriate behavior and so on? Of course, psychoanalysis is probably the theory that has remarked that pleasure is in itself something problematic and that it can become sinister. Just think of Sigmund Freud's remarks on the notion of taboo in Polynesian, which corresponds very well to what Indo-Germanic languages do with the notion of the sacred. In the notion of taboo, Freud remarks, a bit astonished, we have two opposed or apparently opposed meanings. Taboo means on one hand sublime and holy, and on the other hand it means filthy. And that's exactly what happened with our pleasures. They are on one hand sublime and on the other filthy, and they can turn from one appearance to the opposed appearance. Of course, the same goes for Sigmund Freud's notions of pleasure, and especially on his notion of neurotische Unlust, neurotic displeasure, when he states that what patients apparently suffer from in psychoanalysis, at some point they start defending. The very moment when the analyst seems to succeed or threatens to succeed to take away their symptoms, they start defending their symptoms as if they were a treasure. So this means Freud says that there is some unacknowledged pleasure at work in the symptom, and that's what's being defended by the patients. This notion of the neurotic displeasure is basically what Jacques Lacan has then coined in his notion of enjoyment or jouissance, which again is a kind of filthy pleasure and a pleasure that is basically suffering, a pleasure that is under certain conditions or under most conditions experienced as displeasure. Excuse me. Furthermore, beyond pointing out that pleasure can appear in its opposed form, psychoanalysis has also given us another hint, which is, I think, relevant here. In his essay on the uncanny, Freud describes very aptly that whenever pleasure turns uncanny and whenever pleasure turns unpleasant, we do not only have with this filthy pleasure, but we also have to do with an agent that appears as the thief of enjoyment. So whenever you hate your pleasure, you also find the culprit who has taken away your pleasure from you. And I think this is very significant for the postmodern situation. If postmodernism has succeeded in turning our pleasures into displeasures and into matters of disgust and awe, postmodernism has also been very successful in producing thieves of enjoyment. Very prominent thieves of enjoyment these days are, for example, refugees who threaten to take away all our pleasures, but in a more intellectual discourse, it's also very often heterosexual white men. These also have been the big thieves of enjoyment in history. So here we have a number of prominent agents, but these are just two instances of this. In psychoanalysis, the thieves of enjoyment have basically two, I think, shapes. One is the primordial father who enjoys everything and castrates everybody else. And the other is the doppelganger who does also the same. He's this kind of other ego who enjoys in your place and takes away your enjoyment. The doppelganger being the prominent figure of a thief of enjoyment in Freud's essay on the uncanny. Now, I think what is important here to see how the parallactic shift of pleasure into displeasure, or opposed shift from filthy pleasure into sublime pleasure, can be elaborated. I think it is necessary to recall a little bit of theology, if I may enter this foreign terrain here. I present here a little piece of theory that I have developed in my last book, Erwachsenensprache. I think if you very roughly put an image of the history of religions before your eyes, it is, of course, as Emile Durkheim has stated, clear that not all religions do have gods at all. But if religions have got gods, is it not significant that the older a religion is, the younger its gods can be? So older religions have very young gods very often, and very old religions often only have very young gods, where the gods are only children. In the religions that we are a bit familiar with, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, you had all kinds of ages, but you had quite a number of child gods and infant gods who had a very childish behavior. So little Eros, you know, this naked little boy with his bow and arrow, would shoot on the people, totally irresponsible. That's how you can explain why people fall in love with completely inappropriate partners, the doctor father or the psychoanalyst, or whatever may occur. And the Greeks and Romans explained this by the fact that it was not the most responsible god who shot around with his love arrows. So, and of course, in Greece and Roman antiquity, you didn't only have children gods, but also, for example, drunk gods like Dionysus. And you also had sexually greedy gods, men and women who were constantly after human beings and trying to seduce them by taking on the shapes of animals and whatever. And you had very jealous gods, childishly jealous goddesses who start the Trojan War, total massacre just because three silly goddesses want to know who is the most beautiful of them. So I mean, if you try to come to a general judgment about this, we have to say that Greek and Roman antiquity placed their gods and goddesses not only above themselves, intellectually and morally, but they placed them very often below themselves. They were a bit more silly than the humans and morally a bit less responsible than the human beings. The younger a religion gets, I would claim, the more their gods move upwards. So in Catholicism, you have a fair share of this antiquity heritage still. You have some childish personnel, not exactly gods, but at least you have this baby Jesus, and you have a kind of number of naked little angels that emerge in the Christmas decorations of the street with their naked asses and so on. So there's quite some fun with this holy personnel from the heavens that come at some times of the year. Of course, in Protestantism, this has been completely erased. You have just one God, and this God is very wise, knows everything, knows your innermost motivations, and is, of course, not sexually greedy or after you, anything that's far below this God. So, what does this mean, actually, if we can describe the religious development like this? It means that modern people only feel observed from above and from a God, from an instance that reads their innermost motivations. This is very similar to what Sigmund Freud coined under his notion of the superego. That's also an eye that looks down upon you and into you from above. Ancient gods looked upon you from below, and they did not look into you. They just looked how things appeared. We have a certain respect still in our culture for this way of looking at ourselves, for example, in terms of politeness. When we perform acts of politeness, it is not that we care, like upper gods, how we meant it. We only care how it looked. And even if we meant it very honestly, it is a shame if it didn't work on the level of appearance. Not ourselves and not the other, but somebody else could be very disappointed and find this very shameful if we do things not properly. So we have a lot of competence for doing these things properly so that the appearance of politeness can be established and maintained. You have, all of us have a lot of knowledge, for example, what it means to shake a hand. No? Simple act of politeness, but still it has to have a certain speed, not too fast, not too slow. It has to have a certain firmness. You must not squeeze too much, but also not too little, and not to leave the hand too early. And so there's a lot of competences that we apply. And if something goes wrong with this, we feel a bit ashamed, although we know perfectly well that we meant it honestly and so on. But politeness was not completely established, and that means we somehow disappointed a lower instance of observation that only cares for appearances and does not look into our motivation, and we disappointed this, so to say, this gods of appearance. And that can be sometimes very shameful even. So even if you have the most honest feelings and you are at a funeral and you want to express your feelings of sympathy and condolences with, let's say, the mourning widow, but unfortunately, because you are so moved in your heart, you stumble and fall upon the widow and fall with her into the open grave. You meant it honestly and you meant it very sadly, but it looked like slapsticks, and so maybe the whole funeral has to be repeated, or because it's so shameful. This means that we have a certain implicit knowledge of this looking at ourselves from below and looking not only on our intentions but also looking at the appearances. And this is, of course, of crucial importance also for psychoanalysis, which is a theory that looks very much upon appearances, and the whole matter of this initial Zizek statement with regard to Lacan, the unconscious is outside, is precisely a reference to this fact that psychoanalysis does not look how you meant it, but psychoanalysis looks how you said it or how you performed it and reads this appearance. Now, what can we learn here from ancient Greeks? I think the crucial point here is that these childish gods and silly gods that looked upon people from below still were gods and still deserved a certain respect for that. So even if what they wanted was silly, we had to respect them and pay tribute to their expectations. So if they were very silly and just wanted to be entertained, we had to organize, like television programmers of today, we had to organize something so that they don't get bored. We had to present them some sports and some music, so Olympic Games, so that they don't get bored and throw lightnings upon us or something. Sigmund Freud remarks this in a footnote to his 3 essays on sexuality, where he says that ancient people's relationship to sexuality was completely different from that of us moderns. He says the ancients celebrated the drive, whereas we find it necessary to excuse the drive by the advantages of its object. The ancients celebrated the drive. I think the key to this remark lies in the notion of celebrating. You do not celebrate when you want. Celebration is an obligation. And that means that in culture, obviously, we have to do with 2 different types of objects. We have to do with profane objects, which are allowed and possible, like mineral water or beer. Here in Bavaria, you can order a beer for lunch, even I think if you're a policeman or a soldier. Completely profane, at least to a certain amount. But you cannot order champagne with your schnitzel or your Weißwurst. No? That would not only be a strange choice, but you would feel a bit uncanny if you ordered this. Champagne belongs to a different kind of drinks that are either impossible or obligatory. When your colleague in the office or the other professor has got her birthday, of course somebody comes with a bottle of champagne, and if otherwise it's completely prohibited that you drink while working, at this moment the opposite becomes the case, and now it's totally obligatory to drink champagne, even if the doctor has forbidden it to you. You must take a little bit of champagne and congratulate your colleague. So objects that pertain to the order of the sacred have these 2 states of practice. On the one hand, they are forbidden, on the other hand, they are obligatory. And I think this is the solution to the problem in culture that allows us to see the objects under their sublime aspect. Culture has this crucial function, so to say, to reconcile the individuals with the sacred objects by the help of a command. So when I sit at home at night and study philosophy, but some friends knock at my door and says, Robert, you have read enough today, you come with us now for a beer, we have to celebrate, whatever. I gladly come with them, and then the beer becomes a proof that life is worth living for. And the next day, maybe I do not want to think of beer. But under this command, under this cultural command that now it's obligatory that we drink, beer becomes something sublime to me. So we have to acknowledge that people are not spontaneously hedonist, but to the contrary, people are pretty reluctant to enjoy at the very moment when they perceive the pleasure as something pertaining to the sacred, and only a command from culture can help them to transgress these limitations and to transform this sacred object into a sublime object. And then, of course, they enjoy this tremendously, and what they enjoy is precisely also the power of the collective to transform this object into a sublime object. So the beer drinkers somehow celebrate their own solidarity and their own capacity to transform this filthy object into a sublime one. And I think this is the crucial point here in the perception of these objects and in the perception of the others that today mostly appear as thieves of enjoyment, as primordial fathers who tackle us with some offers of alcohol, or the smoker who wants to offer us her cigarette, and so on. Terrible figures that penetrate our innocent intimacy today in postmodernity. I think the crucial perception here, or the crucial question of perception, is always, do we perceive the other as someone who transgresses a boundary, that transgresses a prohibition, or do we see the other as someone who follows an obligation, someone who respects a duty? This is the crucial difference in how we perceive others. David Foster Wallace has, in his talk, This is Water, given a nice example of how this perception changes our judgments fundamentally. He says, when I drive in traffic by car and somebody overtakes me in a very ruthless way and in dangerous way so that I have to brake, and then I get very angry, of course, and I want to shoot him to the moon. Because, of course, I think I follow the rules and the other doesn't. The other is a total lawbreaker and does not follow any rules. You know, psychoanalytically this means we are castrated, the other escaped castration, primordial father on 4 wheels. But Foster Wallace says this is just a matter of imagination, because we imagine it to be like this. We thought we are following the rules and the other somehow escaped the necessity to follow any rules. And this is the enjoyment that he takes away from us. A very questionable enjoyment, by the way. Yeah? Would you like to have this enjoyment? No? Imagine the Bavarian police sends you a letter, dear madam, dear sir, we learned that tomorrow is your birthday, and for that occasion a little contribution from the Bavarian police, you can ride on the highway tomorrow as rule-less as you want, you will not be punished. Would you accept this gift? No? So it is again here what Freud says in the Uncanny essay, when the doppelganger appears, it is about a pleasure that you wouldn't want to have, but still you are very angry that the other takes away this presumed pleasure from you. So Foster Wallace says, it is my imagination or your imagination to think the other is the thief of your enjoyment. The other is the cause why you are castrated and he remained uncastrated. That's not what Foster Wallace says, that's my comment from the psychoanalytic point. But Foster Wallace says, we can form a completely different imagination. We can also think maybe the other has got a terribly wounded child on his back seat, that child that I cannot see from my position of view, but probably he has to bring that child to a nearby hospital as fast as possible, and therefore I would be glad to give way to him, and I would not be angry for him for driving so dangerously. Excuse me. To the contrary, I would be glad to have a chance to help him for this task. So the key question here is, do I perceive this other as somebody who just wants something, who just wants to drive like a madman, Do I see this other, psychoanalytically speaking, as homogeneous, as someone who is like at home in this nasty pleasure, which is forbidden to us, to which I am a foreigner, but the other is at home in this filthy pleasure? Or do I see the other maybe just as split as myself, and see the other as someone who has to follow a duty? The other is maybe very ashamed that he has to drive like a madman, but he still feels he has to do it in order to save the child. If I see the other as split like myself, then I do not have a problem in solidarizing with this other. And I think this is today the crucial problem in culture. We do not see the other as someone who is split. We see the other as someone who is completely at home in his filthy enjoyment that miraculously he can bear, whereas we, subjected to rules, subjected to castration, subjected to health requirements, environmental requirements, requirements of good behavior and so on, we of course are completely deprived from that. And that's also why we very often say, if you have to do that at all, sir, madam, please do it at home. No, we say, if you have to smoke at all, please do it at home, because probably you are at home in this nasty enjoyment and do it there. Like 20, 30 years ago, it was pretty obvious to people that this was not a matter of doing it at home. If you look at the photo albums of your parents and grandparents, you will find them smoking in moments when they were in public. So they smoked just as they dressed a bit more elegantly when they went out, and smoking belonged to their public appearance. It was a tribute to appearance and to politeness to smoke. And at home they did not smoke, only under the condition that they had guests. So even non-smokers had always had a little bit of cigars and cigarettes at home for the case that guests would appear. Then you would have to be more elegant and generous and offer them some. So that was the condition under which smoking took place at home. Whereas today, of course, we presume smoking is something totally filthy that only belongs to the private person and not to the public man and not to the public appearance. It cannot be a duty, it must be an addiction or a filthy passion or something like that. So, I think we have to somehow relearn the lessons of ancient religions that somehow in traces have been conserved also in Catholic religion, that there are silly gods that demand from us sometimes silly things which can become pleasures and which allow us to turn our pleasures into sublime ones. Only under this condition that we feel observed from below, we become able not to see our filthy pleasures only as awful. This is why I suggested a little modification to the Freudian second topology of the psychic apparatus. You know, Freud has there the superego, the ego, and the id. And only the superego is here conceived of as an agency of observation. But actually, if we take Freud's own remarks seriously, especially also his remarks on Heine in the essay on the uncanny, with the gods in exile, gods themselves have become uncanny and nasty because they are not celebrated. Then we can say, okay, maybe from below, from the id, do not only come nasty drives, but maybe the id itself is something that observes us from below and brings with it some nasty duties. Sometimes we have to drink, sometimes we have to smoke, sometimes we have to make silly formulas of politeness that we find silly, sometimes we have to talk to others and be generous or friendly or polite, sometimes maybe we have to do things. And so there can be a lot of silly duties that are implied by silly gods, but the fact that we perceive them with their eyes as duties allows us to turn these filthy things into sublime things, and everything depends on the matter if we regard these lower agencies as instances of observation, as agencies of observation. That's why I suggested to call this lower agency not the id, but the under-ego. I think the under-ego is the instance that observes us, only judges appearances, and helps us to perceive certain things that we are pretty reluctant to do, to perceive them as duties, and to overcome our limitations. So when I go in the early evening to a certain bar, when there's a certain atmosphere, maybe Miles Davis playing on the loudspeakers, then I hear a certain voice from a lower god that says, Robert, don't order mineral water here. So, this is how the lower gods help us to overcome our limitations, to become generous, to become a bit more sovereign, to take life as it is worth living for, and not only serve life as servants of its preservation, as Georges Bataille has put it. And then our pleasures all of a sudden show themselves from the sublime side, and the other, that we hitherto perceived in a postmodern way as a thief of enjoyment, all of a sudden turns into a comrade, a helper to experience the pleasure as sublime, as something that can be shared in solidarity, and something that is pleasant precisely due to the solidarity. And I think this is not only an issue, not only a question of how can we maximize pleasure in life, or how can we have pleasure at all if otherwise it only appears filthy. I think this is also an inherently political question. I think because this somehow comprises or epitomizes an absolute minimum standard of good life that has not been undergone. It's not this notion of good life that yuppie people stress other people with, the sort of refinement of food and holiday destinations and whatever. No, it is this minimum standard of good life without which you do not have any life at all that would merit its name. So people who do not have a notion of this minimum standard of good life would not even know what to fight for in a political sense. And that's, I think, the crucial point for politics. This is my last point today. This is the point made by Bertolt Brecht in his poem Resolution of the Communards, where he lets the Paris fighters of the Commune from 1871 say to their enemies, considering that you threaten us with guns and cannons, we have decided that from now on we will fear bad life more than death. I say it in German, in Erwägung, dass ihr uns nun eben mit Gewehren und Kanonen droht, so haben wir beschlossen, von nun an schlechtes Leben mehr zu fürchten als den Tod. Thank you very much.
Wow. Ja, wir haben jetzt noch gut 10, 15 Minuten, also gleich, stellen wir gleich an. Herr Garner, warten Sie bitte aufs Mikrofon. Ja.
Thank you very much. Very, very enjoyable talk. Just a thought, the conception that you were describing at the end, drawing threads together, brought to mind Nietzsche, and your model seems to be very, very close to what he envisages in The Birth of Tragedy. So
Yeah.
we have the gods observing us, raising our actions and our pleasures and our passions to a higher, elevated level. We conceive of ourselves as part of the activity of the world artist. We recover as solidarity with one another, we affirm life, and so on. Does that resonate?
Absolutely, yes. Of course, Nietzsche was one of my guiding counselors here. I also thought, of course, of his genealogy of morals because what he coins as resentment, I think, is basically what we feel today as this theft of enjoyment.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks a lot. I was wondering if you could say something about what you're referring to in our times as the times of political correctness. I mean, you could see in the United States you have this Trump discourse rejecting political correctness and somehow gaining ground with this polemic he's referring to. And I was wondering if what you refer to as the gods from below, how can this really be structured by the society, or could this be politically somehow implemented, or is this rather something that the individual in his own realm of imagination has to fight for? Because I wonder how that should work, let's say, on the level of a communal experience, reinstating what you refer to these little gods from below as liberating us from this, the pressure of enjoyment.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I think what we encounter here is precisely an intersection of the ethical and the political. I think it concerns very much the question how subjects are being formed by certain apparatuses. And I think there's a big battle going on at the moment, what apparatuses to implement and how to form certain subjects. Do you inform at your university a department for complaints of every kind that gives people the feeling that they are beloved and they are lovable when they are very vulnerable and complain about every little detail that doesn't fit into their worldview? If you do that, of course, then you will have the people that ethically respond to this political implementation. You will have vulnerable people of all kinds that even compete in their vulnerability and sensitivity, and suddenly other people will appear and say, but our sensitivities have not been recognized, we want an own office for our concerns, and so on. So in this way, you have feedbacks, and the political and the ethical start to build up on each other. If, on the contrary, you say, like the Dean of Studies of the University of Chicago, if you say, we are a university for adult people, we count on the fact that our students are adult people and that they have a certain strength to them which allows them to bear worldviews which do not coincide with their own and which are able to say nasty things themselves when nasty things are being said to them, and who are able to behave like adult people and not like little children who have a sensitivity without limits. If you say that, then you will have the corresponding students, and other students will not apply, or maybe will transform a little bit and see that this is also possible, and think, okay, maybe we do not need safe spaces, maybe we need adult spaces, maybe this is what we need. So I think there's a big battle going on about this. And to put it maybe into a slightly different light, I would also say we could describe this also as a battle or as a kind of cultural war between cultural Protestantism today and a kind of inheritage of pagan culture that we find in the southern European countries. And I think many dividing lines today are due to this struggle between the Protestant spirit of neoliberalism, of total purification, of total annihilation of any solidarity that allows to join and to enjoy pleasure in a solitary way, and to remove it totally and to have a total purity and like a zero space of total purity in public space. That's why we have to talk in total pure words and to behave total pure. And so that is what Max Weber and Richard Sennett would have called the Protestant ethics of this neoliberal politics. And it's of course pursued not only by Protestant people. Protestant spirit somehow fires people who are far from religious, but they have a Protestant attitude, as Max Weber already saw this. And on the contrary, you have people who have a feeling that some nasty enjoyment can be shared collectively and thus be transformed into sublime enjoyment. For example, I find it significant that in Protestant countries you have philosophers who go for a total vegan imperative. American colleague wrote a nice book, The Vegan Imperative, Humans Should Not Eat Animals. A French philosopher, on the contrary, has written a book, Defense of the Carnivore. He says, well, it's not that we should eat meat limitlessly, but we should eat meat from time to time and celebrate it and think that it is something wonderful, that we can do it, and we should somehow venerate and celebrate the animal that we eat, and thus we could enjoy it. And I think in many debates, also if you think of the difference between the American feminists and the French feminists in the Me Too debate, you have the same struggle. And it is a struggle, to put it in terms of Emile Durkheim, a struggle between what can be called positive cults. You can celebrate some nasty matters and have some nice action and eat a lot, for example, or negative cults, and you can say, no, we don't eat at all, this is embarrassing, and we abstain ourselves. That would be negative cults. And I think a lot of cultural wars today can be read between agents of negative cults, Protestants, neoliberals, that destroy public space and solidarity, and agents of positive cults that try to defend a minimum livable space in public life.
Okay, thanks, very insightful.
Yeah, just a follow-up question. Thank you. It was extremely interesting. I mean, follow-up question to Dominic Finkelis. I mean, how would you place then the Trump attitude in this picture? Where, I mean, because it seems to be a third position, right, to the to the conflict you just described. I mean, is it something like the position that, I mean, Nietzsche called the Dionysian barbarians? Yeah. So is this the simple release of the filthy enjoyment without the transforming cultural transformation that you described, or how would how would you place it there? So.
Yeah, thank you very much. Exactly, I would exactly coin it like this. I think what one can learn from Gaston Bachelard and Louis Althusser in their epistemologies is that two opposed positions, or that two seemingly opposed positions, can be accomplices. And I think this is precisely the case between what I would say the agents of progressive neoliberalism, as Nancy Fraser has called it, like the Clinton camp, Hillary Clinton camp, and the Trump camp. I think in this point they are complete accomplices. The PC camp is the epistemological accomplice of the Trump camp because both aim at stating that filth is pure filth and cannot be sublimated, and enjoyment can only be nasty, and only people who are very angry can share this nasty enjoyment because it pisses off the other even more than ourselves. No? So Thomas Frank has said nicely, Trump is like the raised middle finger that the disappointed people have shown to the elites. Yeah? I think this is a very good description, but it is an enjoyment that you don't want to have to yourself. You enjoy just the fact that the other is more embarrassed than yourself. And I think also the left has contributed a lot to Trump's success, because the left has given up a crucial heritage that belonged to its political attitude and culture, like smoking, by the way, but also talking in blunt words. That was the attitude of the left until the late 70s, I would claim, and you could recognize the leftist by the fact that he named things by their names. But all of a sudden, the left started to speak this elitist, cleaned language, and of course then people say, when some nasty guy like Trump pops up, they say, oh, that's our man, he talks like us, that's a man of the small people, that's not one of those Washington elites. So they, in this way, also you can see this accompliship between the political correct pseudo-left and this populist right. And against that, I would think that there is a kind of third position outside of this, left of both, that would allow to tackle matters in a clear way, and to speak among adult people.
Maybe one more question, and then we maybe or two more questions, and then
thank you for your thanks for your interesting talk. My question is, I agree, but when you mentioned the Me Too debate, I had to think about, like, yeah, I mean, there are different kinds of pleasures, of course. And I would say, it's, just to put it very bluntly, rape is not the same pleasure as smoking cigarettes, for example.
Absolutely. I hope you don't think I was thinking that.
The man, and then we finish.
When you talked about the ancient Greek gods and their characterization, I was reminded of a line of thought by Zizek when he said that not only Jesus died on the cross, but also God died on the cross, and
But also?
also
Yeah.
God himself died on the cross, and that therefore we are now responsible for everything that happens. We cannot put responsibility on a divine entity and say, okay, we are not really responsible, we're just following God's commands. We can't do that in his interpretation of Christianity. And would you say that the veneration of the ancient Greek gods as like kind of silly and irresponsible gods had in a way the same effect of saying, okay, these gods, they won't do anything for us, we have to do it ourselves, but we have to nonetheless venerate them. But would you say that it has the effect of like returning responsibility to ourselves, because the gods obviously are not capable of taking care for us?
Well, I would say, thank you. I think ancient Greeks did never think that gods could be responsible for the people. That was not their task. That's also, in a way, a funny responsibilization of the gods that occurs in the history of religion, just as responsibilizations of the citizens occurs in the neoliberalism. All of a sudden, you are responsible if you receive pension. You should have taken the right private insurance or so on. And you are responsible if you fall ill, and so we would not pay for you just because you have drunk too much or so. But I think what the Greeks expected from their gods was, to a certain extent, that they believed in human beings. That's a funny reversal of, we think we have to believe in the gods, but I think the Greeks rather thought that the gods believed in them. And because they believed in them, they had to behave a little more generously, a little more polite, and so on. If they lose that belief, then people feel completely disobliged. And I think that's, in a way, what we perceive today.
Perfect. Well, thanks again for this brilliant talk.